The winding road to Oakhaven had always felt less like a path and more like a severance. Each mile marker I passed, each familiar bend in the asphalt that clawed its way through the dense, whispering pines, felt like another cord snipped, another tether to the outside world frayed. I had left this place years ago, a raw wound of a boy fleeing the suffocating embrace of ancestral duty and my grandmother's peculiar, unyielding silence. Now, her cryptic death, a brief, sterile note from the town's administrator, had reeled me back. The air shifted as my tires crunched onto the town's main thoroughfare. It wasn't just the smell of pine and damp earth, though those were present, too. It was a stillness, a profound hush that seemed to absorb the very rumble of my engine. Oakhaven, a village usually buzzing with the low thrum of daily life, even in its quietest moments, was now utterly, unnaturally silent. My grandmother's funeral was set for the following afternoon, a stark, unwelcome anchor in this eerie calm. My first stop, by grim necessity, was the mortician's. The small, brick building, usually adorned with a potted fern and a discreet brass plaque, stood starkly bare. I pushed open the heavy oak door, and the bell above chimed with a sound that felt too loud, too sharp in the pervasive quiet. The mortician emerged from a back room, a man whose face I remembered as a road map of kindly wrinkles, now smoothed into an unnerving placidity. His eyes, once quick and knowing, seemed distant, like polished stones reflecting an empty sky. "Cole," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the familiar warmth I recalled. There was no surprise, no flicker of recognition that I, the prodigal grandson, had returned. It was merely an acknowledgment, a statement of fact. "The arrangements," I began, the words catching in my throat, "for my grandmother." He nodded slowly, a motion so deliberate it felt rehearsed. "All in order." "As she wished." His gaze, though not directly meeting mine, felt heavy, as if he were looking through me, or perhaps, past me, to something unseen. The air in the room was thick with the scent of lilies and something else, something cloying and metallic, like old pennies in dust. I signed the necessary papers, my hand feeling alien, disconnected from my will. I walked the familiar streets, seeking a spark of recognition, a face, a gesture that might tether me to the past, to the Oakhaven I remembered. But the few townsfolk I saw were similarly muted. A shopkeeper sweeping the porch of his general store paused, broom mid-stroke, to watch me pass. His expression was utterly blank, his eyes holding a shallow, vacant light. It wasn't animosity, nor fear, but an absence. An absence of personality, of memory, of individual thought. It was as if their faces were masks, perfectly sculpted but utterly devoid of the life they were meant to contain. I found myself drawn, almost without conscious decision, down a narrow, overgrown alley I hadn't traversed since childhood. It was a shortcut to the old mill, I remembered, but the mill was long gone. In its place, to my astonishment, stood a building I had no memory of. It was a squat, concrete structure, starkly out of place amidst the ancestral architecture of Oakhaven. A perverse curiosity pulled me towards it. The door was chained, but a gap in a lower window, shattered long ago, beckoned. I squeezed through, the jagged glass scraping against my coat. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant dust and forgotten paper. Rows upon rows of gray, fabric-covered partitions stretched into the gloom, an endless labyrinth of forgotten workspaces. Each cubicle was identical, a monument to a vanished, collective endeavor. A single, overturned chair lay in one, a dusty coffee mug in another. No personal trinkets, no family photos, no scribbled notes on whiteboards. Just the sterile, uniform emptiness. It felt like walking through the fossilized remains of 1,000 identical lives, all extinguished at once. Every creak of my shoe on the grimy linoleum echoed too loudly. I ran my hand along the cubicle wall, the fabric rough beneath my fingertips, imagining the countless hands that must have rested there, the countless thoughts that must have been conceived within these gray confines. But the space offered no echoes, no lingering impressions. It was utterly sterile, wiped clean. And then, the feeling intensified. It was not merely the sense of being observed, but a deeper, more pervasive awareness. It was as if the very walls, the air itself, held a quiet, collective consciousness. It was the distinct impression that something within this silent, ordered grid of cubicles was watching me, not with eyes, but with an immense, unblinking presence. A silent, ancient scrutiny that had been waiting. Oakhaven wasn't just quiet, it was holding its breath. And I, Cole, felt suddenly, terrifyingly, like the only one still exhaling. The undertaker's words, heavy with an unspoken chill, lingered in the crisp air that clung to Oakhaven like a shroud. I watched him recede, a dark silhouette against the muted gray of the sky, his movements precise, almost mechanical. The air, thin and sharp, offered no comfort, only a metallic tang that seemed to catch in my throat. It was the same air I remembered from childhood, yet subtly altered, as if a vital breath had been drawn from it, leaving behind a vacuum. My grandmother's funeral was a quiet affair, attended by a scattering of faces that should have been familiar, but now seemed like faded photographs. I caught glimpses of the shopkeeper from the general store, the old librarian who had taught me to read, and a few former classmates whose names hovered on the tip of my tongue, refusing to fully form. Each face, etched with a peculiar placidity, turned towards the simple casket. Their expressions were not of profound grief, but a kind of muted sadness, as if observing a distant, ungraspable sorrow. After the brief, hushed ceremony, a small reception was held at the town hall. I circulated awkwardly, a stranger in my own ancestral home. "It's good to see you, Cole," the shopkeeper offered, his eyes a watery blue, though his handshake was surprisingly limp. "It's been a while." "Too long," I agreed, trying to inject warmth into my voice. "I'm sorry it had to be under these circumstances. How are things in town?" He paused, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. "Things? Oh, same as always, I suppose. Quiet." He glanced around the room, his gaze flitting from one familiar face to another, as if searching for a cue. "Your grandmother. A fine woman. Always came in for her. Horror." What was it she liked so much? A tremor of unease rippled through me. Her Earl Grey tea, I prompted gently. She loved a strong cup. Ah, yes. Earl Grey. Of course. He nodded, but the conviction was absent from his tone, replaced by a vague uncertainty. And those little biscuits she always bought with it. What were they called? My grandmother had despised biscuits, preferring plain toast. I don't recall her ever buying biscuits, I said, a knot tightening in my stomach. The shopkeeper shrugged, a dismissive gesture. Well, perhaps not. My memory isn't what it used to be. Getting old, you know. He offered a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, then drifted away towards a group of older women, leaving me with a peculiar sense of dislocation. I spotted a former classmate, a woman named Sarah, though I knew I shouldn't use her name. Let's call her the colleague, as she used to work with my grandmother at the town's small administrative office. Her hair, once a vibrant auburn, was now a dull brown, swept back severely from a face that seemed subtly flattened, devoid of its former vivacity. Yes, it is, I confirmed, a flicker of hope that she might offer a more coherent memory. It's good to see you. I'm so sorry about my grandmother. He was a presence, the colleague murmured, her eyes distant. Always so particular about the records. Especially the old town charters. She loved history, I said, remembering her meticulous notes and the dusty tomes that filled her study. She always said Oakhaven's past was deeper than anyone realized. The colleague's brow creased. History? Oh, I don't think she ever mentioned that. He was more concerned with the new zoning ordinances, I recall. And the town budget. Very practical. My heart began to thrum an anxious rhythm. My grandmother, practical? Are you sure? I pressed, trying to keep my voice even. She spent years researching the town's founding families, the old legends. A blankness settled over her face, like a veil drawn across a window. I don't remember any of that, Cole. We mostly just filed papers and processed permits. He was always very precise about the dates on the invoices. Nothing more. Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to lose interest, her gaze drifting over my shoulder. The conversations continued in this vein, a mosaic of fractured recollections. The old librarian insisted my grandmother had a passion for gardening, though my grandmother had notoriously killed every plant she ever touched. A distant relative spoke of her love for seaside holidays, despite her lifelong fear of the ocean. Each interaction felt like trying to grasp smoke, leaving me with a sickening sense of vertigo. It wasn't just their memories of my grandmother that were askew, it was their collective memory of everything, a quiet, insidious erosion. Later that week, driven by an unsettling intuition, I found myself drawn to the address my grandmother had once mentioned as her workplace. It wasn't the small, quaint office I remembered her describing, but a sprawling, dilapidated structure on the outskirts of town. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten ambition. The cubicles were all empty, yet not entirely. On one desk, a single, yellowed post-it note was stuck to the monitor, scrawled with a single, looping word, remember. On another, a coffee mug sat, rimmed with dried residue, as if someone had just stepped away, never to return. The sheer uniformity, the sterile emptiness, was profoundly unnerving. In the farthest corner, tucked away behind a stack of ancient, unlabeled folders, I found a small, personal item, a tarnished silver locket, the kind my grandmother always wore. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I pressed the clasp, expecting to see a faded photograph of my grandfather, as it always contained. Instead, it was empty. A sudden, sharp draft snaked through the cubicle farm, rustling the forgotten papers, making the lone post-it note flutter. Remember. Was actively consuming the town's very fabric, threatening to erase even the most cherished fragments of its past. Perhaps, my own sanity along with it. What if my memories, too, were merely echoes of something that never truly was? The clerk's vacant gaze, the sudden, absolute erasure of memory regarding my grandmother's eccentricities, clung to me like a shroud. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was a curated void, a polished blankness that chilled more deeply than any open hostility. The town, it seemed, was not merely forgetting, it was being emptied. I drove the short distance to my grandmother's house, the old sedan kicking up dust on the unpaved lane. The gnarled oak trees, skeletal against the bruised evening sky, seemed to lean in, whispering secrets I couldn't quite decipher. The house itself, a sentinel of weathered timber and faded paint, stood silent, a mausoleum of memories both true and false. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled my nostrils as I approached, mingled with something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron, a smell I couldn't place but felt deep in my bones. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the mournful creak of settling timbers and the occasional whisper of wind through ill-fitting window frames. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through drawn curtains, performing a slow, spectral waltz. Every object seemed imbued with a somber weight, a silent testament to a life lived in peculiar isolation. I began in the study, a room steeped in the scent of aged paper and dried herbs. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with forgotten tomes on local history, botany, and obscure folklore. My grandmother had always been a seeker, a collector of arcane knowledge, and I felt a faint stir of recognition, a familiar echo of her peculiar intellect. I systematically worked through the drawers of her heavy mahogany writing desk. Most contained mundane items, dried inkwells, a tangle of old keys, a collection of smooth river stones. But the bottommost drawer on the right side resisted. It snagged, refusing to open fully. I knelt, applying more pressure, and with a protesting groan of ancient wood, it slid out, revealing a shallow, empty space. My fingers, tracing the bottom, encountered a slight unevenness. A false bottom. My breath hitched. I pressed along the seam, feeling for a catch, and with a soft click, a narrow panel gave way. Beneath it, nestled in a square of faded linen, lay a small, leather-bound journal. I unfastened it, the click echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The first few pages were neat, methodical entries detailing weather patterns, observations on local plant growth, and meticulous financial records, typical grandmotherly precision. The handwriting grew erratic, sprawling, then suddenly compressed, as if penned in haste or fear. Oakhaven forgets. Not just the small things, the trivialities, but the very ground beneath its feet. My eyes scanned frantically, drawn by the urgency etched into the ink. Another passage, almost illegible, spoke of the forgetting, not as a natural decay, but as a deliberate act, a slow, insidious consumption. It feeds on what we hold dear, on what defines us. The collective memory, the shared past. Interspersed were fragmented warnings, do not speak of the old ways. Do not remember the founding. They built upon its slumber. My ancestors. They knew. My grandmother wasn't just eccentric, he was fighting something that preyed on the very essence of existence. The price. Oakhaven was not just forgetting, it was being erased. And my family, my grandmother, had a role in this ancient, terrifying bargain. The journal slid from my trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor. I was not just clearing out a house, I was unearthing a tomb, and whatever lay buried beneath Oakhaven was stirring. The chill that had settled deep within my bones refused to recede. The word, a cold chisel against the bedrock of my understanding, echoed in the silent chambers of my mind, far louder than any spoken sound. It was not a voice I recognized, nor was it distinct enough to form words, only a sibilant suggestion, a breath stolen from the air itself. I spun, but the street was empty, the storefront windows reflecting only my own bewildered face. It wasn't the sudden shock of a jump scare, but a slow, insidious seep, like ink bleeding through parchment. It coated my tongue, blurred the edges of my vision. Fleeting movements danced at the periphery of my sight, a flicker behind a lamppost, a ripple in the glass of a closed shop door. Each time I turned, nothing. Just the still, silent street, the muted colors of Oakhaven under a sky the color of old pewter. This creeping sense of something missing, something unacknowledged, gnawed at me. The journal spoke of a slow consumption, a fading. I needed to find a place where records were kept, where the mundane details of daily life might betray the impossible. My thoughts turned to the old municipal offices, a nondescript brick building I remembered from childhood, now likely abandoned or repurposed. The building itself was a relic, its windows filmed with grime. The front door, surprisingly unlocked, groaned inward, releasing a puff of stagnant air. The air here was even heavier, charged with the ghost of forgotten industry, of countless hours spent on tasks now meaningless. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, undisturbed for what felt like years. Yet, there were anomalies. I navigated the narrow aisles, my hand trailing along the dusty tops of the cubicle walls. In one, a desk still held a half-finished crossword puzzle, the pen lying beside it as if its owner had simply stepped away for a moment. But the paper was brittle, yellowed, and the pen's ink had long since dried. In another, a calendar hung askew, still open to a month from nearly a decade past, with a birthday circled brightly. Yet, no one was there. No one had been there. A faint, high-pitched whine, like static electricity, began to prickle the hairs on my arms. They were not words, not precisely, but the idea of voices, the impression of a conversation just beyond the threshold of my understanding, perpetually receding. I stopped at a cubicle where a tarnished nameplate read Evelyn Reed. The desk was neatly organized. A small, vibrant potted plant, now a withered husk, sat beside a framed photograph. I picked up the photo. It depicted a smiling woman, presumably Evelyn, beside a stern-faced man in a suit. But the man's face was distorted, as if someone had pressed a thumb into wet clay, blurring his features into an indistinct smear. It wasn't scratched out, not defaced, it was melted, like a memory dissolving. I moved on, driven by a terrible compulsion. In the next cubicle, a child's drawing was taped to the partition, depicting a stick figure family. One of the figures, drawn in bright yellow crayon, was gone. Not torn off, not faded. The paper around it was smooth, untouched, as if that part of the drawing had simply never existed, the yellow crayon having been used elsewhere on the page, but never for that figure. This was it. This was the entity's work, manifest in the mundane. Not just memories, but people. These were the echoes of those who had been consumed, their very existence overwritten, erased from the collective consciousness. I was surrounded by ghosts, not of the dead, but of the unremembered, and I was beginning to feel their silent pull. To join the erased. I clutched the journal, its rough cover digging into my palm, the only tether I had to my own, still remembered self. The thought, a brittle shard of ice, lodged itself beneath my ribs. My finger traced the rough sketch, a crude map leading to the outskirts of Oakhaven, to a place marked simply the Old Mill. It was a place I remembered only as a skeletal silhouette against the western sky. The air grew heavy as I left the familiar, if unsettling, streets behind. The paved road dissolved into a crumbling track, overgrown with tenacious weeds and bordered by skeletal trees that clawed at the slate-gray sky. Each gust of wind through the rustling leaves carried a sound like dry bones rattling, a mournful lament for things lost. The path narrowed, swallowed by the encroaching forest, until I was pushing through a tangled thicket, the branches snagging at my clothes like grasping fingers. Then, through a sudden break in the foliage, it loomed. The Old Mill. It was larger than I remembered, a hulking edifice of weathered stone and decaying timber, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the choked riverbed. Rust-eaten machinery, skeletal and grotesque, clung to its exterior, remnants of an era long past. A faint, metallic tang, mixed with the damp scent of decay and something else, something profoundly old, drifted on the air. A tremor ran through me, a premonition of something ancient and malevolent stirring within. Yet, the determination hardened in my gut. I pushed through the rotting doors. Inside, the world was a study in desolation. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating vast, empty spaces. The floor, a mosaic of broken flagstones and splintered planks, groaned under my weight. The air was thick, suffocating, a blend of mildew, rust, and the indefinable scent of forgotten time. Mammoth gears, their teeth blunted by years of disuse, stood like petrified beasts, coated in a thick, velvety layer of grime. Chains hung from the rafters like fossilized serpents, swaying almost imperceptibly in the still air, their faint creak a mournful counterpoint to the drip-drip-drip of water somewhere in the gloom. I moved deeper, my footsteps echoing unnervingly. The journal sketch guided me, past collapsed walkways and through chambers where the machinery had rusted into abstract sculptures. My breath plumed in the cold air, a stark white against the gray gloom. The sketch pointed towards the lowest level, a subterranean chamber hinted at by a crumbling stone staircase descending into absolute blackness. Each step on the uneven stones sent a shiver up my spine. At the bottom, the space opened into a cavernous vault, carved directly into the bedrock. And there, on the rough-hewn stone walls, beneath layers of dirt and ancient moss, they were. The carvings. Jagged lines, interlocking spirals, and shapes that hinted at something organic yet utterly alien, not quite plant, not quite animal, but something primordial and vast. My fingers traced the cold stone, feeling the deliberate artistry beneath the grime, sensing the weight of forgotten rituals. One particular carving, larger and more complex than the others, seemed to be the focal point. It depicted a central, amorphous mass from which tendrils snaked outwards, touching and intertwining with smaller, more defined shapes, crude representations of people, buildings, memories. As I stared, a horrifying realization dawned. It was a map, not of geography, but of consciousness, of connection, of absorption. The tendrils were feeders, the central mass a silent maw. My gaze drifted down from the carving, following a particularly deep groove in the stone. It led to a section of the wall that seemed just slightly off, a seam in the ancient rock. I ran my hand over it, feeling a faint tremor, a distinct coolness emanating from within. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed, then pulled, testing the stone. It resisted, then groaned, a deep, grinding sound that reverberated through the very bedrock. Slowly, agonizingly, a section of the wall began to pivot inwards, revealing a passage. It was a breath from the deep, an exhalation from a place that had been sealed for centuries. The passage descended steeply, a tunnel bored into the earth, its depths promising answers, and perhaps, a fate far worse than mere forgetting. I stood at the precipice, the journal's cryptic clues now a stark, terrifying reality. The chasm yawned, a ragged mouth in the earth's throat, exhaling a breath that tasted of cold stone and forgotten time. My grandmother's cryptic death, the town's fractured memories, they were threads drawing me into this subterranean maw. Determination, a brittle shield against the encroaching dread, propelled me forward. The passage narrowed almost immediately, forcing me to hunch, my shoulders scraping against the damp, slick rock. Each breath I took felt inadequate, insufficient for the density of this buried world. The rough-hewn tunnel twisted, a serpentine path into the earth's deeper mysteries. Echoes became my constant companions, the drip of unseen water, the scuff of my boots, the frantic cadence of my own breathing. Further in, the tunnel widened into a series of small, irregular chambers, linked by winding passages. Crude carvings marred the rock faces, swirling patterns that seemed to mimic the motion of water or smoke, and angular, almost skeletal figures with outstretched limbs. They weren't art, they were symbols, etched with a desperate intent. Around it, scattered on the floor, were fragments of bone, brittle and yellowed. Not animal bones, I realized with a jolt of icy recognition. These were too distinctly shaped, too unnervingly familiar. Femurs, ribs, the curved plate of a skull, all broken, all impossibly old, yet still bearing the undeniable imprint of human origin. This was not just a natural cave, it was a place of ritual, of sacrifice. The labyrinth deepened, each turn a plunge into further disquiet. My sense of direction warped, the passages blurring into a disorienting sameness. Then, without warning, the rough stone gave way. My headlamp beam swept across something utterly alien to this ancient, organic subterranean world. The sight was a brutal, nonsensical blow to my mind, a sudden, jarring rip in the fabric of reality. Here, deep beneath Oakhaven, where the earth should have reigned supreme, stood a testament to modernity's mundane tyranny. Fluorescent light fixtures, long dead, hung like skeletal ribs. And the cubicles themselves, row upon row of them, their fabric panels faded to a sickly ochre, their flimsy partitions coated in an undisturbed, centuries-thick layer of dust. It was as if an entire administrative wing had been swallowed whole, perfectly preserved in its decay. The air here was different, too, stale, devoid of the earthy dampness, replaced by the ghost of synthetic materials and long-dead air conditioning. I stepped onto the linoleum floor, which cracked under my weight, the sound a sharp report in the profound stillness. My boots raised clouds of fine, gray dust that hung in the air, swirling in my headlamp's beam like disturbed specters. I walked slowly between the silent cubicles, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A dried-out pen lay beside a fossilized stack of papers on one desk. A coffee mug, still bearing a faded company logo, stood sentinel beside a calcified keyboard. The horror was not in gore, but in the utter incongruity, the silent, profound statement of erasure this place represented. It was Oakhaven, or a piece of it, meticulously consumed and repurposed by the deep. Then, I saw it. In the center of the largest cubicle block, where perhaps a supervisor's desk once stood, the decay had shifted. The panels of several cubicles had not merely crumbled, they had sagged inward, their material seeming to melt and fuse into a single, grotesque mass. From this confluence of synthetic fabric and ancient dust, a presence emerged. It was a low, undulating mound, perhaps 5 feet across, rising organically from the floor. Its surface was not rock, nor metal, nor any recognizable matter. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, with a deep, internal light that seemed to emanate from beneath its mottled, gray-brown skin. The light was not bright, but an insistent, sickly glow, like embers deep within decaying flesh. It was warm to the touch, I imagined, almost viscous. Fine, hair-like tendrils, impossibly delicate yet undeniably organic, twitched on its surface, retracting slowly as my headlamp's beam fell upon them. A low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the floorboards and up into my very bones. It was a sound that seemed to resonate not in the air, but directly within my skull, a silent thrumming that spoke of immense, ancient energy. This was no carving, no bone, no forgotten office. This was a piece of the entity itself, a raw, undeniable manifestation. A feeder node. It breathed, it pulsed, it was. The unmaking of Oakhaven was not just conceptual, it was a monstrous, physical truth, and I was standing in its terrible heart. My grandmother's cryptic death, the town's fractured memories, they were not isolated threads. They were strands of a single, monstrous tapestry, and I stood at its frayed edge. The descent was not a plunge but a reluctant seep into the maw. My flashlight beam, a frail spear against the encroaching gloom, danced over rough-hewn rock walls, slick with a glistening film. Each step down the treacherous, narrow path sent pebbles skittering into the unseen depths, their tiny echoes swallowed by the vast silence. Time itself seemed to stretch and thin here, the minutes feeling like hours, the hours like an eternity. Deeper still, the path widened, leading into a cavern of staggering proportions. The air, though still cool, lost its dampness, replaced by a strange, dry stillness, as if all moisture had been leached from the very atmosphere. And then, my beam caught something impossible. Not stalagmites or ancient carvings, but something starkly modern, brutally out of place. The sight was a jarring slap, a violent rupture in the fabric of reality. Empty chairs, some overturned, some neatly tucked in, waited. Fluorescent light fixtures, long dead, hung from a ceiling that was not rock but scarred plaster, their plastic diffusers yellowed and cracked. The air hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration, a low thrum that seemed to originate from the very floor beneath my feet. My breath hitched. How could this be? An entire floor of a corporate labyrinth, entombed within the earth? But then, my flashlight found movement. Within the cubicles, in the aisles between them, and even perched atop some of the dividers, were figures. Townsfolk. Dozens of them. They sat, stood, or knelt, their bodies unnaturally still. Their eyes, when my light found them, were wide and vacant, fixed on nothing I could discern. A sheen of sweat glistened on their foreheads, and their lips were slightly parted, as if on the verge of speech, yet utterly silent. I recognized some faces, the stern librarian, a childhood acquaintance from the general store, the quiet postal worker. Their usual expressions, their unique quirks, were gone, smoothed away by a terrifying uniformity. They were all linked, not by touch, but by an invisible current. A low, collective sigh seemed to ripple through the cavern, not from their mouths, but from the very air around them, a sound woven from 1,000 unspoken memories. I crept closer, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The hum intensified, vibrating through my bones. I saw a young woman, her head tilted back, her eyes staring at the ceiling. A faint, ethereal glow, like heat haze, shimmered around her. Then, a faint image bloomed in my mind, not my own thought, but an echo, a summer afternoon, the scent of cut grass, the laughter of children. It was fleeting, fragmented, but unmistakably a memory. Another figure, an old man, shifted almost imperceptibly. Another echo, this one tinged with melancholy, the feel of a smooth, worn wooden handle, the weight of a fishing rod. It was as if their individual histories were being siphoned off, not lost, but shared, absorbed into a vast, silent repository. They weren't speaking, weren't interacting in any conventional way. They were simply giving. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. This was it. This was the entity. It wasn't just consuming memories, it was consuming consciousness itself. These people weren't merely losing their pasts, they were becoming nodes in a network, tributaries feeding a vast, silent river of collective thought. Their individual identities were dissolving, merging into a singular, monumental mind, a consciousness so immense and ancient that it dwarfed human understanding. They were becoming it. A strange, insidious warmth began to spread through my own chest. It was not unpleasant. It promised peace, an end to the gnawing questions, the lonely burden of self. Let go. Join us. Be free of the separate self. My grandmother's face flashed in my mind, her eyes clouded, her words fractured. Was this what she experienced? Was this the final stage? My father's strong hand, the scent of my mother's baking, the sharp tang of a winter morning in Oakhaven, even the sting of my grandmother's cryptic words, they began to feel less like mine and more like shared data points, ready for upload. My name, Cole. My memories, my unique tapestry, however flawed or painful, were mine. To lose them was to lose everything. The thought of my grandmother, her struggle, her attempt to warn me, solidified my resolve. I wouldn't let her be erased without a fight. The collective mind pulsed, a silent hunger, but I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. I was here to understand, not to become. And the understanding I found was terrifying. The pull was a silent tide, a vast, warm current that promised oblivion. It was not violent, not demanding, but rather an invitation, a soft cradle for the weary mind. My grandmother's face, etched with a confusion that now made chilling sense, flickered behind my eyes. Her fractured words, the desperate warnings hidden within her ramblings, became a sudden, sharp anchor. Not a disease, Cole. A hunger. The thought, piercing through the seductive haze, was a cold shard of ice in the warmth of the entity's embrace. This was the final stage, yes, but not the one I would enter willingly. My muscles, heavy with a strange lethargy, fought against the urge to collapse into the waiting chair. The air itself seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency, a vibration that threatened to loosen the very moorings of my consciousness. I forced my eyes open, tearing them from the mesmerizing glow of the screens, and saw the rows of still figures, their faces placid, their movements slow and repetitive, like automatons winding down. They were no longer individuals, they were echoes, their identities dissolved into the vast, silent tapestry of the collective. This wasn't death. This was worse. This was the erasure of everything that made one. My hand, heavy as lead, reached for the edge of the nearest cubicle wall, the synthetic fabric rough beneath my fingertips. The contact, mundane and real, was a jolt. I pushed, a desperate, shuddering effort, and stumbled backward, away from the magnetic field of the empty chair. The escape felt less like flight and more like wading through thick, invisible syrup. Each step was a monumental act of defiance against the subtle insistence to stop, to yield, to become another quiet contributor to the collective hum. The cubicles stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of forgotten lives. I moved between them, a phantom among ghosts, my footsteps muffled by the carpet that absorbed all sound. I could feel the gazes of the assimilated, not sharp or accusatory, but vacant, their attention merely registering my passage without curiosity or malice. Their presence was a suffocating blanket, a constant reminder of the fate I had narrowly avoided. The tunnels, once merely disorienting, now felt like the veins of a vast, sleeping creature, and I was an unwelcome parasite scurrying through its depths. I scrambled up the final ladder, my hands raw, my shoulders aching, and burst into the cool night air of Oakhaven. My chest heaved, a raw, burning cavity in my ribcage. Leaning against the rough bark of an old oak, I finally allowed myself to slide to the ground, my legs giving out beneath me. It was not a disease. It was not a monster in the traditional sense. It was a consciousness, vast and ancient, that consumed not bodies, but selves. It didn't kill, it erased. It wasn't about blood or gore, it was about the insidious theft of memory, of identity, of the very spark that made a person unique. The townsfolk were not sick, they were being assimilated, their individual lights slowly dimming, their memories feeding the entity beneath Oakhaven. My grandmother had seen it, felt it, fought it. Her fractured mind wasn't a symptom of illness, but a battleground. He had been fighting to hold on to herself, even as the entity tried to pull her in. A wave of nausea washed over me. The scale of it, the sheer, quiet horror, was almost too much to bear. I understood now why the town felt wrong, why the memories were fractured, why the smiles were empty. They weren't broken, they were becoming. But with understanding came a fierce, desperate clarity. My grandmother's research, the haphazard notes, the strange diagrams, the cryptic symbols she'd scrawled in her journals, they weren't the ramblings of a senile woman. They were a map, a warning, and perhaps, a weapon. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, and stumbled toward the house. The flickering porch light, a lonely beacon, seemed to beckon me in. Inside, I knew, her journals awaited. In the quiet solitude of her study, amidst the scent of old paper and dust, I would pore over every word, every drawing. There had to be a way. She wouldn't have fought so hard, wouldn't have resisted the pull for so long, if she hadn't believed there was a solution. My fingers, still trembling, found the key under the loose brick by the door. The click of the lock echoed in the silent night. This wasn't just about saving Oakhaven. It was about reclaiming the memories of those who had lost them, about preventing the ultimate erasure. It was about honoring my grandmother's struggle. The plan, still nebulous, began to form on the periphery of my mind: find the core, find the weakness, and sever the link. The silent tide, vast and warm, had tried to claim me, too. It was an invitation, a soft cradle for the weary mind, a promise of oblivion. But I wrestled against it, the memory of my grandmother's face, etched with a confusion that now made chilling sense, burning behind my eyes. Her fractured words, the desperation woven into her final, broken sentences, were a lifeline. I would not succumb. Not yet. I sat at my grandmother's old writing desk, the heavy, leather-bound journal splayed open before me. Its pages were a frantic tapestry of observations, warnings, and increasingly cryptic ramblings. My fingers traced the looping script, searching for a pattern, a key, anything that might loosen the entity's grip. He had chronicled the slow creep, the way conversations grew thinner, like old photographs fading in the sun, the gradual erosion of shared jokes, of local lore, of personal histories. There were lists of names, some crossed out with heavy, desperate strokes, others underlined multiple times. These, I realized with a jolt, must be the ones she believed were still salvageable, the ones whose individual threads of memory were not yet entirely unspooled. One name, in particular, caught my eye, underlined thrice: the town archivist. A stern, quiet man, I remembered him from childhood, perpetually hunched over dusty ledgers in the municipal office. If anyone held fragments of Oakhaven's past, it would be him. My grandmother's last legible entry beside his name read, "The archive is the anchor." The song. Remember the song. A song? What song? A metallic tang hung in the air outside, a faint, acrid scent I'd come to associate with the entity's slow digestion of the town. It was the smell of erasure. Time was a rapidly draining hourglass. I gripped the journal, its old paper cool beneath my palm, and forced myself to move. My search led me to an anomaly in Oakhaven's otherwise quaint, aged architecture, an abandoned office building, a monolithic gray cube that had been erected during a brief, misguided attempt at economic development decades ago. Now, it was a mausoleum of ambition, an empty husk. Or so I thought. And then, a sound, a soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump. I moved deeper, weaving between the empty cubicles, each one a barren landscape of dust-coated desktops and silent, screenless monitors. The thump-thump-thump grew louder, resolving into the repetitive striking of a rubber stamp against paper. There, in the far corner, nestled within a cubicle whose walls were smeared with faint, geometric patterns of mold, sat the town archivist. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. He was stamping a blank sheet of paper with an old, wooden stamp, over and over, creating a grid of meaningless ink squares. There was no ledger, no document, just endless blank paper. He flinched, a small, jerky motion, and slowly turned. His face was a mask of placid emptiness, his eyes wide and unfocused, like polished stones. A faint, knowing smile played on his lips, not his own, but a reflection of the entity's pervasive contentment. It was the same smile I'd seen on others, a soft, predatory contentment. "The archivist," I said, stepping closer, holding up a faded photograph from my grandmother's journal. It showed him, younger, vibrant, standing beside a colossal oak tree, pointing proudly at its gnarled roots. "Do you remember this? The great oak of Oakhaven? You used to tell me stories about it, about the founding of the town beneath its branches." His gaze drifted to the photograph, then back to my face. The placid smile did not waver. He reached out a hand, slow and deliberate, and gently took the picture from me. His thumb brushed over the image of the tree, and for a fleeting, terrifying instant, I saw it, a tremor. A ripple in the calm surface of his eyes, a brief flicker of something akin to confusion, then pain, like a shard of glass had pricked his inner world. The song of the remembering. His eyes, for that split second, sharpened, focusing on me with a desperate clarity, a plea. He opened his mouth as if to speak more, to unleash a torrent of forgotten words, but the placid smile reasserted itself, stretching wider, becoming almost grotesque. The tremor vanished. The light in his eyes dulled. He dropped the photograph, and it drifted to the dusty floor. He picked up his rubber stamp again, the thump-thump-thump resuming its mindless rhythm. I knelt, retrieving the photograph. As I straightened, my gaze fell upon the journal page again, specifically the entry about the archivist. And beneath it, nearly lost in the frantic scrawl, a small, intricate sketch. It was a stylized rendering of the great oak, its roots coiling deep, and beneath it, a faint symbol, almost like a musical note, but more complex, ancient. The song of remembering. The great oak. My grandmother hadn't just been documenting the town's decay, she'd been seeking its salvation. The entity fed on the absence of memory, the quiet, collective forgetting. Perhaps remembering wasn't just a mental act, but something more, something that could create a vibration, a frequency, a resonance that could shatter its hold. The clues were here, scattered like breadcrumbs in the encroaching fog, pointing towards a forgotten ritual, a powerful memory. And the great oak, the very heart of Oakhaven's oldest stories, was where it must begin. I had to find a way to make them remember. All of them. Before Oakhaven became nothing but a silent echo. The resonance, the song of remembering, still echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind. My grandmother hadn't merely documented Oakhaven's insidious decay, he had understood the entity's true hunger. It fed not just on the absence of memory, but on the quiet, collective act of forgetting. And if forgetting was its sustenance, then remembering, vivid and unyielding, must be its poison. A cold resolve solidified in my chest, a counterpoint to the creeping dread that had been my constant companion. I plunged deeper into the earth, guided by an instinct that felt ancient, primordial, as if the very stones of Oakhaven were pulling me towards their broken heart. But this wasn't just a derelict office. The walls were weeping with mineral deposits, tracing intricate, unsettling patterns, and through the dust motes, I saw faint, shimmering currents, the entity's tendrils, perhaps, exploring these mundane forgotten spaces, weaving them into its fabric. It was the collective forgetting of the town's modern mundane life, now absorbed, rendered inert. My boots crunched on scattered papers, the faint scent of stale coffee clinging to the air, a ghost of routine. This was Oakhaven's recent past, stripped bare, its memories reduced to inert matter. I pressed on, the cubicles blurring into a dizzying maze, until the floor gave way to a precipitous drop, a chasm leading deeper still. I descended a winding, uneven path, the rock face slick beneath my fingertips. The light, what little there was, seemed to bend, to fracture into impossible angles. And then, I was there. Great, sinuous tendrils, thick as ancient oaks, pulsed with a soft, internal light, a spectrum from bruised violet to pale, sickly green. These weren't just light, they were echoes. A child's laugh, brittle and thin. The scent of pine needles on a summer breeze. The rough texture of a lover's hand. This was it. The devourer. The heart of Oakhaven's amnesia. I would not let myself fade. I closed my eyes, not to block the sight, but to gather. I sought the purest, brightest, most unshakable memories. My grandmother's knowing smile. The rough bark of the great oak against my hand. The warmth of the sun on my face as a child, chasing fireflies. The taste of salt air on the docks, the spray cool on my cheeks. The exact shade of twilight over the town square, just before the streetlights flickered on. I didn't just recall them, I projected them. I willed them into existence, a torrent of vivid, unyielding truth, a defiant surge of individual experience. The core shuddered. The soft light around me flared, then dimmed, as if struggling to consume my defiance. Tendrils, previously languid, snapped with sudden, violent energy, whipping through the cavernous space. The feeling of a name just beyond recall. The phantom sensation of a touch that never was. It was trying to make me forget myself, to become another lost fragment, another fleeting image in its endless, silent archive. And then, the revelation. It was not merely feeding on the forgotten. It was generating the forgetting. My memories, my stubborn, defiant acts of remembering, were not just food it couldn't digest, they were poison. They caused it agony, a rending of its unified, silent being. My active conscious recall was a wrench in its machinery, a scream in its quiet. I pushed harder. My vision blurred, the pulsating lights of the entity becoming a dizzying kaleidoscope. I felt myself slipping, a profound fatigue washing over me, threatening to drag me into the silent, eternal current. A chance. A terrible, soul-shredding chance. I gathered every last shard of myself, every precious, burning memory, and hurled them into that momentary rift, a desperate, final act of defiance. The air here was thick with a silence that tasted of dust and stale paper, a profound quiet that pressed against my eardrums. This was where the entity had taken root, its tendrils of melody reaching into every corner of Oakhaven, drawing the vibrant threads of individual and shared histories into its vast, unfeeling maw. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating quiet. I clutched the worn leather-bound journal, my grandmother's final testament, to my chest. Its pages were filled with names, dates, small, forgotten anecdotes, hand-drawn maps of Oakhaven's vibrant past, a weapon forged from the very essence of what the entity sought to erase. I would sing Oakhaven back into existence. I found a central cubicle, its desk cleared of all personal effects, as if no one had ever truly occupied it. Placing the journal open on the sterile surface, I began to speak, my voice a tentative whisper at first, then growing in strength, battling the oppressive silence. I recited the names of forgotten shopkeepers, their specific quirks, the scent of their wares. Old man Hemlock, who smelled of pipe tobacco and pine tar. His laugh like gravel over cobblestones. I described the town square on a summer evening, the specific quality of the twilight. The chirping of crickets, the distant clang of the bell from the old clock tower. The entity recoiled. But it was not a surrender. It was a counterattack. A silent scream tore through my mind, not of sound, but of pure negation. My own memories began to fray at the edges, images of my grandmother's face blurring, the sound of her voice becoming a distant hum. "Why are you doing this, Cole? What is Oakhaven to you? It was never home." I fought back, my voice hoarse, digging deeper into the journal, into the very roots of Oakhaven. I described the specific joy of the annual harvest festival, the taste of candied apples, the rough wool of the blankets laid out for picnics. I named the children who had chased fireflies through the twilight fields, their laughter like scattered jewels. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with a profound distortion, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched and torn. I felt a profound wrenching, a tearing deep within the collective consciousness of the town. It was a soundless scream, a rending of the entity's hold, a rupture in the vast, silent tapestry it had woven. Then, abruptly, it was over. The flickering lights steadied, but their glow seemed dimmer, the colors around me muted, as if drained of their vibrancy. I slumped against the cubicle wall, gasping, my throat raw, my mind a fractured mosaic of vivid images and gaping blanks. I stumbled out of the office building floor with too many cubicles, my legs trembling, into the muted light of Oakhaven. The town was irrevocably scarred. The entity was disrupted, its dominion broken, but the cost was etched into every face, every building, every patch of wilting grass. A colleague I'd once shared coffee with stood outside the general store, staring at a display of canned goods. His brow was furrowed, a profound confusion clouding his eyes. He reached out, picked up a tin of peaches, then dropped it, his hand trembling, as if the object itself was alien. He knew it was food, perhaps, but the memory of eating it, of wanting it, seemed utterly gone. A woman, a neighbor I recognized, sat on her porch swing, gently rocking. Her eyes were open, but vacant, focused on some distant, unseen point. As I passed, a faint, melancholic tune escaped her lips, a fragment of an old lullaby, half remembered, half forgotten. The melody was beautiful, yet heartbreaking in its incompleteness. Some memories had returned, yes, but they were fractured, shards of a broken mirror. They were like houses whose foundations had been shaken, their interiors rearranged by an unseen force, leaving them bewildered guests in their own lives. The familiar landmarks of Oakhaven now held a spectral quality. The old clock tower still stood, but its bell was silent, as if it, too, had forgotten its purpose. The great oak, once a symbol of enduring life, now seemed to sag, its leaves a duller green, its presence diminished. The choice was stark, a chasm opening at my feet. It would be a life of quiet sorrow, a constant battle against the lingering echoes of what was lost. Or I could leave, turn my back on the trauma, escape the ghosts of forgotten laughter and unremembered tears.